Josh Frydenberg, thank you for joining me. Just 2 months ago, your Treasury officials were tipping that up to 150,000 Australians could lose their jobs if you turned off the JobKeeper subsidies. You went ahead, and the real number turns out to be just 30,000. That's in fact great news. But how did Treasury get this so wrong?
Well, making forecasts in the middle of a pandemic is difficult, let alone forecasts out of a pandemic. But the reality is the strength and the resilience of the labour market has very much surprised on the upside. These job numbers today, Andrew, show that 33,800 new full-time jobs have been created in the month of April, the month following the end of JobKeeper. And indeed, in the 6 weeks following the end of JobKeeper, 132,000 people have come off income support. It's been a remarkable story to tell about how the unemployment rate today has fallen to 5.5%. The underemployment rate is now the lowest in 7 years. The youth unemployment rate is the lowest in 12 years. And we remember how the Labor Party said the sky would fall in with the end of JobKeeper, how we needed to keep spending more than $2 billion a month on that emergency support program. We said no. We held firm. We ended that program. And now we can see in the numbers that the jobs are coming back and the unemployment rate is coming down.
Look, I have no doubt at all. I've said earlier in the show, this is great news. And I said last night that Labor was looking stupid with that call on JobKeeper. But I'm worried about the predictions. That was only 2 months ago, that prediction I mentioned. It's already clear, it seems to me, that your budget last week was much too pessimistic about this recovery. For instance, yesterday's wages figures showed wage growth in the first 9 months of this financial year is already what your budget predicted for the whole year. Wages are rising faster than you predicted just last week. Are you now going to have to change your budget approach to allow for the fact that this recovery is faster than you thought?
Well, certainly with the economy strengthening faster and the recovery happening faster than we thought, that is good news for the budget bottom line. We know, Andrew, for example, having a couple of hundred extra thousand people in jobs as opposed to being on welfare is worth about $5 billion to your budget bottom line because you have increased tax receipts and lower welfare payments. And the way we actually balanced the budget for the first time in 11 years before the pandemic hit was because we got welfare dependency down to a 30-year low. So what we're striving to do is to get more people in work, and by repairing the economy, you're repairing the budget. So that's our strategy. That's why we've invested more in skills, in infrastructure, in business incentives for businesses to invest, as well as tax cuts for more than 10 million Australians around the country.
Yeah, but if the economy is recovering faster than you predicted, then perhaps there's a danger in stimulating it too much. And in fact, there's another danger. You've got jobs better than you expected, wage rises faster than your budget expected just last week, and that threatens another thing that you're counting on, that inflation interest rates stay low and interest payments on our debt don't get unmanageable. But in the US this week, you've seen the inflation jump to 4.2%. Is it the same sort of thing going to happen here? Do you need to cut the stimulus sort of spending now a little sooner than you thought?
I think we've got the settings right in the budget, which, as you know, was just released last Tuesday. But we do also understand there's a great deal of uncertainty out there, Andrew. We're still in the middle of a pandemic. You've seen Europe go into recession, come out of recession, and then now dip back into recession. You've seen the United States spend $1.9 trillion, but not to get the lift off in employment that we've seen here in Australia. And we've seen more than 800,000 new COVID cases around the world each and every day. And obviously those horrible, terrible images coming out of India. So there is uncertainty out there. And the budget was designed to lock in our recovery, to ensure that we capitalise on the gains that we've made. That's why we're doing what works. Infrastructure, skills, tax relief, business investment.
But your predictions weren't... Yeah, but your settings were based on predictions that seem to have been too pessimistic. I'm just wondering whether you are now contemplating already perhaps you're cutting some of that spending a little bit and start to tackle the massive debt that we have, nearly $1 trillion in 4 years, because the threat of the interest rates rising is rising itself.
Well, the Reserve Bank has publicly said that it's not expecting to move on interest rates for some time to come. And historically and globally, we're seeing low interest rates, which is obviously helping to reduce the service repayments that we have on our debt. And we've factored that all in to our numbers. But the measures that we've used to stimulate the economy, like the tax relief, like the business investment incentives, also have a broader payoff. They're consistent with our values. So those settings remain right. And if the unemployment rate gets lower than 5% earlier than we've forecast, which is at the end of next year, then we would welcome that. But there is a great deal of uncertainty out there, and we've got to be very conscious that we can't take for granted the good fortune and the good recovery that Australia is now seeing.
Now, meanwhile, the Victorian government, which was the harshest in terms of shutdowns, the most incompetent as well in terms of quarantine hotels, has now revealed a budget to try and pay for the mess, among other things. Quite extraordinary. Your focus is on getting unemployment down to under 5%, with a 4 in front of it, you keep saying. But the Victorian government has just gone almost like the other way, it seems to me. It's put a levy on businesses paying $10 million a year in payroll, put a levy on them to raise nearly $1 billion a year eventually. I mean, what on earth is going on there?
Well, Labor's tax grab in Victoria is coming at the worst possible time, just as the recovery is gaining momentum. It's a tax grab that's going to hurt families, it's a tax grab that's going to hurt business, and it's a tax grab that costs jobs. And it is a sign and a prelude of what will happen with federal Labor.
Treasurer, before we go, Australia's Journalists' Union, it's backing a petition demanding journalists treat Israel as the aggressor in a war that was actually started with a missile attack by the Hamas terrorist group that runs Gaza. And on this show, I've given many examples now of the ABC's anti-Israel bias, also painting Israel as the villain, as the aggressor. How troubled are you by this bias?
Well, everyone needs to tell the facts. And the facts with respect to the Middle East dispute that we're seeing and the battles that are playing out is that Israel has been subject to a bombardment from terrorist organisations. It's not the first time, it won't be the last time. And Israel has a right to defend itself. You know, Australia has a very proud history of bipartisan support for the State of Israel. If you go back to Israel's formation in 1948, Australia chaired the UN committee that signed off on the partition plan. Australia was one of the countries that voted in favour of Israel's admission to the United Nations. And it was said at the time by Doc Evatt, a former Labor leader, that Israel's independence was the right thing to do, was the just thing to do. But ever since that day where Israel came into formation, it hasn't been accepted by its neighbours. They have challenged its right to exist. And therefore it's developed a very capable military, but it's also has had to respond with force to attacks on its country and its people. And that's what it's responding to right now. Missile attacks on Tel Aviv, missile attacks on other parts of the country. Australia is concerned.
And the ABC's coverage, are you disappointed by it?
Well, again, I think you do see examples across the media of coverage that does not reflect the true state of affairs. I'm pleased to say when I turn on Sky News and I hear from you or Rowan Dean or from others, you tell it as it is. And that is important for the Australian people to understand the threats that Israel faces, and they are threats that are coming from terrorist organisations. We are concerned by the loss of life on both sides. That is why it's so important that we see a two-state solution But people do need to understand that Israel is a democracy. It is existing among many countries that don't accept its existence, let alone some of the terrorist organisations that are seeking to undermine peace.
Josh Frydenberg, thank you so much indeed for your time.